What if the most dangerous deception facing the church today does not come dressed as rebellion, but as obedience? What if it does not sound like heresy, but like faith itself, soft, familiar, comforting, and strangely reassuring? Ask yourself this without rushing past it. How many times have you heard words that sounded holy, felt right in the moment, and yet required nothing real from your life? There is a deception that does not shout. It whispers. It does not attack the gospel. It imitates it. And the reason it goes unnoticed is precisely because it feels safe, because it affirms instead of confronts, because it promises peace without ever passing through truth. This is where the danger begins, and it is far closer than most are willing to admit. There is a version of the gospel that asks nothing of you except agreement. It does not call you to die. It invites you to adapt. It does not disturb your loyalties. It rearranges your language. Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw this long before it became common, before it filled pulpits and platforms, before it learned how to disguise surrender as wisdom. He warned that the church's greatest threat would not come from those who openly reject Christ, but from those who speak his name while quietly emptying his words of their weight. When grace becomes cheap, when truth becomes flexible, when discipleship becomes optional, something sacred is being replaced, slowly, politely, and with applause. This deception survives because it feels merciful. It tells you that following Jesus should never cost too much, never isolate you, never place you at odds with the spirit of your time. It offers belonging without obedience, forgiveness without repentance, comfort without transformation. Bonhoeffer understood that when the gospel no longer wounds before it heals, it has already been altered. The cross becomes symbolic, sacrifice becomes metaphorical, and faith becomes a private sentiment rather than a public surrender. And yet, the most unsettling part is this: the more this message spreads, the more it sounds like the real thing. That is how falsehood survives, by borrowing the voice of truth. If this feels uncomfortable, it should, because the deception Bonhoeffer warned about does not live outside the church. It grows quietly within it. It reshapes expectations, softens convictions, and teaches believers to confuse peace with avoidance. And once this shift is complete, resistance feels unnecessary, courage feels extreme, and obedience feels outdated. But Bonhoeffer insisted that the gospel was never meant to blend in. It was meant to stand apart. What happens then when the message that claims to save you is the very thing preventing you from seeing the cost of following Christ? That question cannot be answered quickly, and it cannot be answered without going all the way to the end. There is a subtle moment in the life of faith when something shifts without permission. It does not arrive as rebellion or denial. It arrives as relief. The sharp edges soften. The urgency dissolves. The voice that once disrupted your inner order becomes easier to live with, easier to quote, easier to carry without weight. Nothing is demanded immediately. Nothing presses against your instincts for survival, belonging, or approval. And for a while, this feels like peace. But Bonhoeffer understood something most never articulate. When faith stops unsettling you, it may already be training you to accept a version of obedience that asks for almost nothing. The gospel was never meant to coexist quietly with your life as it is. It was meant to interrupt it. And interruption, before it transforms, always feels like threat. This is how the deception first gains access to the soul. Not through contradiction, but through accommodation. Christ is not denied, he is adjusted. His words are not rejected, they are softened until they no longer pierce. Obedience becomes internalized, symbolic, postponed. Conviction becomes tone rather than action. Grace is redefined, not as the power that pulls you into costly faithfulness, but as the permission to remain unchanged while feeling forgiven. Bonhoeffer warned that this was not a harmless shift in emphasis, but a spiritual exchange taking place in silence. When grace loses its cost, it also loses its authority. What once demanded your life now only asks for agreement. And agreement, unlike obedience, does not transform anything. At this stage, nothing feels false. Everything sounds familiar. Scripture is still quoted. Worship still happens. Language remains reverent. And that is precisely why the deception is so difficult to detect. Because what is missing is not belief, but gravity. Not faith, but consequence. Bonhoeffer saw that the church is most vulnerable not when it is under attack, but when it is affirmed without being tested, because affirmation without tension trains the soul to confuse comfort with truth. And once that confusion settles in, the conscience begins to sleep while calling it rest. As the spiral deepens, the deception begins to speak more confidently. It appeals to something deeply human, the desire to belong without being exposed. It tells you that standing apart is unnecessary, that blending in is wisdom, that restraint is maturity. It teaches you to interpret isolation as arrogance and conviction as imbalance. Bonhoeffer lived in a world where these arguments were not theoretical. He watched entire institutions baptize silence as prudence and neutrality as virtue. He saw how quickly fear could be spiritualized and caution could be praised as discernment, and he understood a truth that remains unbearable. Faith without action does not remain neutral. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, aligns itself with whatever power promises stability. What makes this alignment so dangerous is that it rarely feels like betrayal. It feels responsible, measured, reasonable. The soul convinces itself that resistance would be excessive, that courage would be reckless, that obedience can wait for better conditions. And so, belief remains intact while allegiance quietly shifts. Bonhoeffer warned that the greatest moral collapses do not begin with hatred of truth, but with the fear of consequence. When fear is allowed to guide interpretation, even the gospel can be reshaped into something that never threatens the structures it inhabits. Over time, an inner fracture forms. You still believe, but you no longer know what belief requires of you. The message you hear reassures you, but it no longer rearranges your priorities. It comforts you, but it does not confront you. This is not disbelief. It is something far more subtle. It is faith without urgency. Bonhoeffer insisted that the church could endure persecution more easily than it could endure comfort without courage. Because comfort teaches the soul to avoid the very tension where obedience is forged. And once that tension disappears, so does the willingness to be transformed. At this point, the silence inside grows heavy. A question begins to echo, faint but persistent. Something feels unresolved, incomplete, strangely hollow. The deception does not ask you to reject Christ. It simply teaches you to delay him. Later, it says, when life is calmer, when obedience will not disrupt too much, when the cost will be lower. Bonhoeffer recognized delay as one of the most effective forms of disobedience, because truth that is always postponed never truly arrives, and a calling continually deferred eventually dissolves into abstraction. The soul begins to distrust seriousness itself. Depth becomes suspect. Conviction is labeled extremism. Obedience is reframed as rigidity. Under this logic, faith becomes something to manage rather than something that claims you. You learn to admire Christ without following him too closely, to speak his name without allowing it to reorder your life. Bonhoeffer rejected this completely. For him, Christ was not an idea to be contemplated, but a command that interrupts. A voice that breaks into ordinary life and demands a decision. And interruption, by its nature, always feels invasive before it feels liberating. Yet even here, something refuses to disappear. A restlessness that reassurance cannot quiet. A discomfort that explanations cannot resolve. Bonhoeffer believed that God often speaks not through comfort, but through disturbance. Not through clarity, but through summons. And when that summons is ignored long enough, the soul learns to call avoidance peace. But the unease remains. It lingers beneath the surface, pressing gently, relentlessly, asking whether safety has replaced faithfulness. and whether that replacement has already cost more than obedience ever would. Now the tension tightens. The gospel stops feeling distant and begins to feel personal. It presses against your decisions, your silences, your careful justifications. Bonhoeffer insisted that following Christ would always produce friction, with culture, with institutions, with the instinct for self-preservation. The moment faith stops producing that friction, it has likely been reshaped into something manageable, something polite, something safer than truth. And safety, when mistaken for holiness, becomes its own form of captivity. It protects the self while slowly eroding the soul. Fear emerges here with full force. Fear of what obedience might cost. Fear of standing alone. Fear of losing approval, identity, stability. Bonhoeffer did not deny this fear. He walked through it. He understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to allow fear to decide what is right. The deception wants fear to feel virtuous, caution to feel wise, retreat to feel responsible. But Bonhoeffer argued that wisdom is not found in self-preservation. It is found in faithfulness, even when faithfulness isolates, even when it wounds, even when it leads toward uncertainty. By now, the question can no longer be avoided. Is the gospel you have received capable of transforming you, or only of comforting you? This is not accusation. It is invitation. An invitation to look again, to listen more deeply, to recognize that only a gospel that costs something can save something. Everything else merely preserves appearances, and the discomfort rising inside you is not meant to drive you away. It is meant to draw you closer, to the edge where belief becomes allegiance, where words become life, and where truth finally stops sounding safe. And now what remains is not an answer, but a resonance. Like a bell struck once and left to vibrate in open air, something lingers beneath the words you have just heard. The images may fade, the arguments may soften at the edges, but the unease stays. Bonhoeffer believed that truth rarely ends with clarity. It ends with responsibility. When the gospel is real, it does not close neatly. It opens something inside you that refuses to return to sleep. Perhaps that quiet tension you feel is not confusion at all, but recognition. A remembering of something you always sensed was missing, now gently brought back into view. The journey does not conclude here because faith was never meant to conclude in thought alone. It settles into the spaces between decisions, into moments of silence where no one is watching, into the private negotiations of the soul. Bonhoeffer warned that the most decisive battles are fought inwardly, long before they are visible outwardly. What you do next may seem small, even invisible. But it is often in these unseen places that allegiance is chosen, that comfort is released, that truth is allowed to carry weight again. The question is no longer what the gospel says, but what it is quietly asking of you. Imagine faith not as a possession, but as a path that narrows the further you walk it, not because it excludes, but because it clarifies. Bonhoeffer understood that the narrowness is not cruelty, it is focus. It strips away what distracts until only what matters remains. If something has been stirred in you, if a familiar restlessness has found new language, do not rush to silence it. Sit with it. Let it speak. Often, the voice we resist most is the one calling us back to what is real, costly, and alive. If this reflection has touched something true within you, do not let it remain isolated. Truth grows when it is shared, tested, spoken aloud. Leave a comment with the question that stayed with you the longest. Share this message with someone who feels the same quiet tension but has not yet found words for it. And if you choose to remain here, to follow this path of deeper listening and courageous faith, consider subscribing, not as a habit, but as a commitment to stay awake, because some echoes are meant to be followed, not forgotten.